Bitcoin is just money. And then you go, okay, well, what is money? Well, what is money is, to me, probably the most intellectually stimulating question I've ever asked in my life, and one that continues to throw up answers, um, a question that continues to throw up answers that I hadn't considered before. But when I think of what is money, well, money I think of as a technology. Money solves a very specific problem. Money is something that humans and humans alone, I believe, have developed in order to trade with each other. So the thing I always found most helpful when asking the question, what is money, is actually a history lesson on the types of money that we've used. And you can go as far back as you like, but when humans had when we existed in small hunter-gatherer tribes, we actually had very early forms of debt. So I would be the hunter, and someone else might be the fisherman, and I want to trade my gazelle for a fish, and I one week would catch something and they might not, and so you'd be like, okay, you owe me some fish, or I owe you some gazelle. And because the tribes are very small, you can figure that out in your own head. And so, small packs of people, they all know, okay, roughly I owe you this much, you owe me this much, and you can kind of keep it in your head. Now, that is a very early form of credit. And if you haven't read Broken Money by Lynn Alden, this is one of the key concepts I got out of that book that I hadn't covered before. That basically, debt is a very, very useful thing, right? I owe you. Like, fair enough. Okay, I'll pay you back in the future. Now, there's all sorts of different types of debt. That's not what this question is about, but definitely look into that. Anyway, as things get more complicated, and let's say another tribe comes along, it's like, well, how do you trade with the other tribe? You can't be like, oh, you owe me some fish, because you might never see them again. And so we started using things like glass beads, ornamental shells, and there's a very famous story around the Yap Islands, these things called Yap stones that we used. This developed into more kind of commodity style monies, like a bronze, a silver, a gold. This very what's the right way of saying it? Like, this dates back, you know, well, when are the first types of coinage used? I think this is King Croesus, and hence Jesse Myers's original Anon profile. If you haven't come across his work, it's absolutely fantastic. Thousands of years ago, essentially, we started using coins, and this developed into the most probably important phase for money in my view about 150 years ago, the Gilded Age, which was a true gold standard where every nation's currency was pegged to a specific amount of gold. This transferred, and again back to broken money, into then the development of the telephone, and the communications networks that we had were basically, they were faster than gold. You couldn't send gold from the UK to the US, but you could send some kind of paper derivative of it, and that's really where fiat currency saw product market fit, is you could send it across space very, very easily. To do that, however, you had to centralize the system. So you had to give someone, aka a bank, your trust that they were going to balance their books correctly. And anyone who is my age, 36, has seen multiple bank runs in their lifetime. And I'm from the UK and now based in Australia, so fairly well run financial systems. Other parts of the world, not so good. Anyway, back to the question of what is Bitcoin? Well, it's money. And money is something that over time has changed. Humans have tried thousands and thousands and thousands of different iterations of what makes a good money. And this is when I found, for example, the Austrian School of Economics. So there's a guy called Carl Menger back in late 1800s, produced a book called The Origins of Money. And essentially there have been people studying what is money as a question for, like, well, in this case, 150 years, but very, very deep analysis into this question. And I, for some reason, conspiracy maybe, but highly trained into how to make money. In that I went to business schools. I come from families that run businesses, and always thinking like how to make money, how to make money, how to make money. It's like, well, never once stopped to ask the question, what is money? And that's the key thing about Bitcoin. Basically, Bitcoin is just another iteration of the history of money. And 100 years from now, will be looked back upon as an absolutely critical ingredient for the adoption of the digital world. And so I now see Bitcoin as purely a form of money, but also digitally native. And we can go into more specifics about what Bitcoin actually is and how it functions. But just to continue on this idea of like what money is, well, there's a certain type of characteristics that make a good money. And this is why it's really important to think from a first principles approach with questions like this, with this kind of question. And so, um, forgive me, I'm not going to remember every single characteristic, but for example, divisibility, durability, scarcity, fungibility, these are all things that make a good money. So, for example, you use grain as money. Well, grain perishes. So actually, grain's not a very good money because a couple of months from now, what I used as money is going to be germinating and sprouting. And the same could be said for like the stool that I'm sitting on. Like you can just make loads of them. So what's the point in having a stool? Or a stool's also not very portable, right? Like how do you carry around bits of furniture as a form of money? Anyway, as beginner content, I just encourage you to ask this question, like, what is money? And you'll find that actually there's a very clear and methodically thought out system of which, like, okay, well, these types of characteristics are the kind of things that make you really good money. And until Bitcoin, in my opinion, gold was the best form of money. And once you've looked at those characteristics, well, certain things immediately just don't really work. But what the Austrian school points out so well is that it's essentially the most saleable good. So if you find something that ticks every box, I think it's about 6 characteristics that you're looking for, then that's the most saleable good. And so think about a marketplace. You go to the marketplace with whatever you have produced, whatever you've specialized in, and you want to leave that marketplace with as much return as you can possibly get, with as much optionality as possible. So if you turn up and just start swapping your stuff for other items that you've got to then transport back somehow that might perish or they're too big, like that's actually not very useful. And so that's where this idea of the double coincidence of wants appears. And so again, going back to that early idea of a tribe, I can just remember what I owe you and you remember what you owe me. But suddenly you've got a marketplace with all these different people coming from different places and in engaging in voluntary trade. Money was the technology that appeared from the free market to solve the problem of double coincidence of wants. So if someone has 30 oranges and you've got one banana, well, you can trade the fruit, of course, but equally, wouldn't it be just much easier if you could use something in between that meant that actually you just pay for that one banana and you pay for that one orange? And that's what money is. So money itself is the most saleable good. It is actually a good itself. So it's like a thing. So you can use different things as money. And it performs 3 key features. So the features are, and the ones we're most familiar with, the medium of exchange. So it's like you turn up and you use your money to get things, right? But you can also call it a unit of account. Second feature, the unit of account, you're on your spreadsheets, you're looking at the values of things, you're looking at prices, and a lot of information is portrayed in a price, right? It's like, actually, it's quite incredible when you go into a grocery store and all these prices all around you signal value, but equally represent everything that went into that one thing in that moment from the entire supply chain and all of the different bits of trade that had to happen to get that one item there. Recently, I had Max Hillerbrand on the podcast. Shout out to Max, and he told a brilliant story as to like how hard it is to make a pencil. Like one individual does not know how to make a pencil. It requires specialization, it requires trade, and money is the juice that keeps the whole thing kind of going. And so as I kind of finish this thought process, like you ask the question, what is money? And then suddenly you start to see there's this very systematized process of like, well, what makes a good money? And just Bitcoin is the perfect money. And so as a beginner, if you haven't asked the question, what is money? Do that first. But then when you start asking that question, you can dig into it a bit further and you start to see how Bitcoin matches up to what was previously studied as hypothetically perfect. Like there's some great quotes from Austrian economists from like 30, 40 years ago that pre-Bitcoin, they were basically describing Bitcoin, right? The more that you can ground your research in things that make sense from a first principles perspective, the better, because Bitcoin suffers hugely from what's called FUD, so fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And basically, the status quo system is not just willing, but fully able to throw a lot of shit on this new thing, and that is namely central banks. And central banks are extraordinarily powerful because they have monopolized the ability to print money in certain geographic jurisdictions. And it's absolutely crazy when you start asking the question, well, what is a central bank? The final and third feature is store of value. And actually, shout out to Hubertus, who just came on the podcast and clarified this for me for the first time. I didn't understand this properly, but store of value from an Austrian economist perspective was simply the ability for the money used to just hold value in the marketplace. So retain purchasing power. And if you don't know what purchasing power is, you need to find that out. That's a very, very important point. But essentially, your money you can spend or you can receive, or equally, you can measure the value of things through prices with it. And finally, if you just held it, i.e., saved it, it stores value. And this is a really critical point because I actually, as an investor, I buy Bitcoin primarily for its store of value function. Pre my conversation with Hubertus, I was of the opinion that store of value also equaled capital growth. And that was the beauty of Bitcoin. But actually, a pure Austrian economist perspective is that store of value is simply just holding purchasing power, not necessarily growing. I'll come on to that later because that's a bit more complicated. But okay, cool. We've talked through the features of what money is. And so Bitcoin basically is, it ticks every characteristic unbelievably well. It then does all three of the features that it's required to do. So you're like, it's just money.